Hello, this is John Egan in Honolulu. I'd like to introduce the idea of assessments in disaster response and humanitarian assistance. Disaster assessments are essentially surveys. You get into the scene of a disaster and you need to estimate the actual and potential damages in order to make recommendations for getting a response in place. And this process is really critical to getting the initial phase of a disaster response into action. These assessments have been done by many different organizations over the years. The United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Group is very involved in this. Many different national disaster response organizations also have assessment teams, and all of them are now striving to come up with some common standards. The initial responses to an emergency really will vary depending on the type of emergency that you're speaking of. A slow onset disaster or a rolling disaster like a famine may have a much different sort of requirement for a rapid assessment than would a sudden onset disaster like an earthquake. And certainly our complex emergencies that have armed conflict as the base of the disaster have their own characteristics as well. Each of these different types of disaster have distinct features that will influence how an assessment is done. Certainly the immediacy and duration, as we mentioned, but also how far-reaching is the disaster and how deeply has it affected the local population. And sometimes these characteristics have political dimensions and complexity levels that really require very in-depth, careful assessments. But to begin a disaster response, we need to start with a rapid response, getting in there and guiding the people who are following on as to what really needs to be done. Dr. Skip Burkle, presently with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and also affiliated with the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, has written extensively on the topic of evidence-based health assessments as being a good basis for disaster rapid assessment approaches. He points out that the humanitarian community has a professional obligation to base its assistance on the best evidence available. And he suggests that the epidemiological approach, using statistical information on valid indicators, is actually a very useful and potentially powerful tool for developing the basis for disaster assessments. He in fact suggests that by getting an accurate statistical basis for understanding what's going on with the public health dimensions of a population, that we can actually determine what stage a disaster is in. And here he points out that the normal rate of crude mortality in a developing country may be 0.5 per 10,000 in a given day. When that number of crude mortality reaches 5 per 10,000 per day, that we're looking at an extreme disaster event, something, a severe famine, a severe disaster, and that we can gauge the effectiveness of our relief effort by watching those numbers and seeing when they get back into a more reasonable frame. Rapid assessments build the foundation on which ongoing surveys and surveillance must follow. Public health, in great measure, is a function of knowing what is the health status of a particular community. Our rapid assessments really should be lined up with the basic statistical information gathering that we'll need to do this on an ongoing basis. To do that, we need to gather the information accurately on a timely basis and use valid indicators. And some of the types of indicators: what are the endemic diseases in the area, what are the pre-existing mortality rates, what are the morbidity and incidence rates, nutritional status of the population, and what impacts the disaster has had on the disruption of health services. These are indicators that give us some basis for going forward with determining how effective our intervention may be. So the objectives of a rapid assessment should be to determine the magnitude of the emergency, identify existing and potential public health problems, to measure present and potential impacts, especially those dealing with health and nutritional needs, to assess the resources that are required, including understanding the availability and capacity of a local response, and those would help us to determine and plan an appropriate external response. When we have these types of information moving, then we can begin to see how we move from emergency response into setting up the basis for a health system.